Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we look at a nationwide transport blockade in Mexico that has disrupted major highways and border crossings, the likelihood of unrest in Honduras ahead of a tightly contested general election, and Washington's preparations for a new phase of operations designed to further pressure Venezuela. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we assess Belgium's three-day general strike over proposed austerity measures, the latest round of diplomacy on Ukraine, including a revised 19-point peace proposal, Israel's strike on a senior Hezbollah figure in Beirut, and the military coup in Guinea-Bissau. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine Pakistan's ongoing cycle of terrorism and retaliatory strikes in Afghanistan, and the widespread flooding affecting southern Thailand and northern Malaysia. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where farmers and truck drivers in Mexico have staged a nationwide transport blockade, causing major disruption. On November 24, a coalition of farmers and truckers parked trucks, tractors, and other farm vehicles across major federal highways, toll roads, industrial zones, and approaches to the U.S.-Mexico border. The action was organized by unions and groups such as the National Front for the Rescue of the Mexican Countryside and the National Association of Transporters, along with several smaller organizations. The protests have severely affected transport and business operations, with blockades reported in as many as 25 states. Although several blockades have now been removed, farmers and truckers are still maintaining roadblocks in multiple states. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Mexican farmers are demanding fair crop prices and relief from rising production costs, while truckers are calling for greater security on highways, protection from extortion, and stronger government support for the transport sector. Their objectives differ, but their coordination has allowed them to create greater disruption and visibility, leading to negotiations with the government. However, farmers and agricultural workers walked out of talks with the Interior Ministry on November 25th after their demands for higher crop prices and a review of the water law were not met. Their walkout also reflected wider frustration with current levels of insecurity across the country. Truckers have yet to begin formal negotiations with the government, but they continue to insist that hijackings, cartel-linked extortion, and cargo theft have made the industry increasingly unsafe and economically unsustainable. While some highways have reopened, the protests are likely to continue until substantive demands are addressed, and ad hoc blockades designed to pressure the government into negotiations remain likely. These actions follow the recent so-called Gen Z protests in Mexico City, which mark the first major challenge to President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration since she took office. Those demonstrations were also shaped by concerns over insecurity, triggered by the assassination of a popular anti-cartel mayor in Michoacán. The convergence of three major protest movements, each driven in part by a deteriorating security environment, points to widespread frustration over the government's perceived inability to curb cartel violence, despite the Sheinbaum administration adopting a more coercive approach than its predecessor. This trend suggests that periodic large-scale, disruptive, and potentially nationwide protests may become a recurring feature in Mexico, as groups seek to pressure the government into addressing cartel violence and broader insecurity. Staying in the region, we move to Honduras, where a tightly contested general election is almost certain to trigger unrest once results are announced. Honduras is scheduled to hold general elections on November 30th to elect the president, members of the National Congress, and 20 members of the Central American Parliament. The president will be chosen in a single-round vote, with the candidate who receives the most ballots set to succeed, President Xiomara Castro, who is constitutionally limited to one term. Current polling shows a closely fought race between Salvador Nasrallah of the Liberal Party and Nasri Asfoura of the National Party, with both running neck and neck. Libre's Rixi Moncada trails in third place, indicating that there is no clear frontrunner. Now our assessment. The main parties have already warned of fraud. The Attorney General's office has alleged that the opposition is planning to manipulate the results. And a leaked audio tape suggests that the military, which is typically aligned with the National Party, has attempted to influence the vote. More recently, the military requested access to tally sheets in violation of Honduran electoral law. That move has almost certainly heightened fears of institutional interference. Given the narrow polling margins and Honduras's long history of disputed elections, post-election unrest is highly likely. Previous contested votes, including the 2017 election, led to almost a month of violent street clashes, curfews, mass arrests, and nearly 40 deaths after the opposition claimed there had been widespread fraud. In 2009, after the military ousted President Manuel Zelaya, large-scale mobilizations paralyzed parts of Tegucigalpa and other cities for weeks. If the elections are contested, which is highly likely, large-scale protests are expected. Roadblocks and barricades may appear on major highways and around government buildings, and violent clashes with the security forces are likely. The security forces are expected to use tear gas, rubber bullets, mass arrests, and, in extremis, ammunition to disperse crowds. Curfews will also likely be imposed in major population centers. And lastly, in the Americas, the United States is preparing a new phase of Venezuelan operations aimed at increasing pressure on the Maduro administration. According to undisclosed U.S. officials, Washington is preparing to enter a new phase of operations designed to increase pressure on President Maduro. This phase will reportedly begin with covert actions, forming the initial component of a wider campaign aimed at undermining or potentially overthrowing his government. The officials also said that President Trump is willing to use every element of U.S. power to stop drugs from flooding into the country and to bring those responsible to justice. The report follows the formal designation on November 24th of the Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization by the White House. President Maduro responded by addressing his supporters in Caracas while wielding a sword, accusing Washington of seeking to oust him and vowing to fight what he called imperialist aggression, suggesting that the U.S. objective is to seize Venezuela's natural resources. Now, our team's assessment. The disclosure of a new phase of operations beginning with covert action will likely allow the United States to maintain strategic ambiguity in the immediate future. There is no defined scope or timeline for these clandestine and sensitive activities, and covert operations offer a high degree of plausible deniability, making them difficult to attribute. The announcement is likely to increase psychological pressure on the Maduro administration by implying that Washington is prepared to, or is already, engaging in hostile activity within Venezuela. This pressure could push the regime either towards talks with the U.S. or into an overreaction that could backfire and further isolate President Maduro, such as intensifying internal crackdowns. The U.S. strategy towards Venezuela has so far been marked by a series of military moves, policy changes, and disclosures aimed at steadily increasing pressure on President Maduro, while signaling that Washington is preparing to commit to direct strikes inside the country. These steps have included naval deployments, strikes on vessels in international waters, B-52 bomber flyovers, foreign terrorist organization designations, the authorization of covert operations, and the delayed arrival of a carrier strike group. With the recent arrival of the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group in the Caribbean, and the FTO designation of the Cartel de los Soles, an organization Washington directly links to Maduro and senior Venezuelan officials, the U.S. is now likely in a position to exploit existing counterterrorism authorities to target the regime. It has also established a credible deterrence and strike capability in the Caribbean region. However, there is a critical vulnerability in this approach. The US now has the military assets in theater to achieve many of its stated and assumed objectives. If Washington continues to issue threats without taking some form of visible action, there is a growing risk that the Maduro administration will come to view these signals as mere coercive posturing and interpret them as a strategic bluff. While the risk of miscalculation or escalation is now at its highest, there is a realistic possibility that, if the US fails to act after such extensive signaling, the strategy will lose credibility and fall short of its likely objective, pressuring regime change or compelling Maduro to enter negotiations favorable to Washington. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Belgium has experienced a 3-day nationwide strike in response to proposed austerity measures. Several of Belgium's largest transport and public sector trade unions, including Akkoord Spoor, ACV Transcom, and VSOA Spoor, organized a nationwide general strike from November 24th to 26th. The action was called to oppose the government's proposed austerity measures and cuts to social protections. It caused significant disruption to air travel, rail services, and other forms of transport. On November 26th, all departing flights from both Brussels Airport and Charleroi Airport were cancelled, and metro and tram services in Brussels were sharply reduced. Additional public services, including waste collection, were also heavily affected. Now, our intelligence assessment. The 3-day nationwide strike follows a series of large-scale protests and walkouts across Belgium, organized by the trade unions in response to the same proposed austerity measures. However, unlike the October protests, which drew tens of thousands of participants and escalated into violent clashes with police in several cities, the recent strikes have focused on coordinated walkouts and picket lines aimed at causing disruption, with no significant demonstrations or incidents of violence. Even so, the industrial action has been highly disruptive and is driven by the same underlying grievances. The new right-wing government, led by the Flemish nationalist Bart de Wever, has proposed a raft of austerity measures to address Belgium's high public debt. These include increasing the retirement age, reducing state pensions, and cutting unemployment benefits. Belgium is also facing heightened pressure from the EU, which is enforcing strict fiscal rules on countries that fail to keep public debt within the revised Stability and Growth Pact thresholds. These pressures are likely to push the new government towards implementing and proposing further austerity measures throughout 2026. Further rounds of disruptive strikes and protests across Belgium are highly likely as reactions to these measures, leading to significant disruption to transport and businesses. Large-scale demonstrations in response to wide-reaching reforms, particularly those affecting pensions, unemployment benefits, and broader social protections, are expected. These protests could escalate into violent clashes with the police, especially in the Wallonia region, where opposition to austerity and to the new government's Flemish nationalism is most entrenched. Moving on to Ukraine, where a complex round of diplomacy has produced a revised 19-point draft peace plan. After the provisional US-backed 28-point peace plan was briefed to the press on November 21st, President Donald Trump set a November 27th deadline for Kyiv to agree to it. The 28-point proposal included multiple concessions to the Kremlin's maximalist demands and was swiftly condemned by Kyiv and its European allies. Reuters reported on November 26th that, according to 3 sources, the plan drew from a Russian-authored non-official communication that had been submitted to the Trump administration in October. Bloomberg also published leaked transcripts of an October phone call between U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and senior Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov, as well as a call between Ushakov and Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev. In those conversations, the 2 Kremlin figures agreed to push for the maximum with the U.S., and then, failing that, at least it'll be as close to it as possible. Following a flurry of diplomatic engagements between the US and Ukraine, most notably in Geneva on November 23rd, The plan was revised from 28 points to 19, with Kiev agreeing pending what were described as minor details to be sorted out. By November 25th, President Trump had stepped back from the November 27th deadline. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov commented on the revised plan by insisting that the proposal must reflect the spirit and letter of Moscow's demands established at the August Alaska summit. Overnight, on November 24th and 25th, Russian forces launched 22 missiles, along with more than 460 one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicles and decoys. It was a large-scale wave of aerial attacks, primarily targeting Kiev. Ukrainian authorities reported at least 6 deaths in Kiev and 12 injuries. Targets reportedly included the combined heat and power plants CHP-5 and CHP-6, as well as the Kiev hydroelectric power plant, with power outages recorded in multiple districts following the strikes. Now our team's assessment. It is unlikely that the current surge in diplomacy will produce an imminent peace deal. The revised 19-point draft plan, which Kiev has reportedly agreed to on a provisional basis, leaves the most contentious issues, including territory and NATO relations, placed in brackets, requiring further leader-level talks. Fundamentally, Kiev almost certainly cannot agree to many of the maximalist demands in the original 28-point plan without leaving the country critically vulnerable to a future Russian reinvasion that could pose an existential threat to Ukrainian sovereignty. While the Zelensky administration may be able to tolerate major concessions to end the war, credible security guarantees are almost certainly a necessary red line for Kiev in any settlement. However, providing such guarantees in a meaningful way is likewise likely a red line for Moscow, particularly if they involve the deployment of foreign troops from NATO member states in Ukraine. With the likely presence of mutually exclusive red lines for any potential peace agreement, further movement towards a settlement would almost certainly require additional conflict capable of coercing concessions from either side. However, there are 2 key extenuating factors that could help bridge the divide. First, Kiev is almost certainly heavily incentivized to maintain U.S. support, given how critical U.S. intelligence and military aid, now delivered through sales to European partners, is to Ukrainian defense. The Trump administration is therefore able to exert considerable pressure on Kiev to make concessions. Second, Moscow is highly likely to be motivated to ward off U.S. pressure and to use diplomatic developments to advance its maximalist objectives, as it has done during previous periods of Trump-led diplomatic engagement. The large-scale strikes carried out primarily against Kiev took place the day after the November 23rd negotiations in Geneva. The timing of major Russian aerial attacks over the past year suggests a possible correlation between diplomatic developments and strikes on Ukrainian cities, with large-scale attacks having previously followed prominent Ukrainian diplomatic engagements opposed by the Kremlin. On the one hand, there was a notable lull in Russian long-range fires in the run-up to the Alaska summit, highly likely intended to reduce pressure on President Trump to take a more hardline position against Moscow during the meeting. On the other hand, the current scale of Russian strikes, particularly those targeting Ukrainian critical national infrastructure, is likely placing significant pressure on Kiev, given the threat of mass power outages during a freezing winter. The Kremlin is likely attempting to demoralize Ukraine's population and promote war exhaustion through these strikes on critical infrastructure, while also increasingly targeting civilian residential buildings. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine reported on November 25th that Russian strikes have inflicted 4 times more casualties in Kiev between January and October 2025 than in the whole of 2024. Given the mounting pressure on Ukraine, Russian forces are likely to maintain the tempo and scale of strikes against urban centers in the coming weeks. Still in the region, in Lebanon, Israel has struck a senior Hezbollah commander in an operation inside Beirut. On November 23rd, the Israeli Air Force carried out an airstrike in the southern Beirut suburb of Haret Hraik, targeting Hezbollah's acting chief of staff, Haytham Ali Tabtabai. The strike hit a multi-story residential building in a Hezbollah stronghold. According to the Lebanese Health Ministry, at least 5 people were killed and 28 wounded. Ahead of the strike, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told his cabinet that Israel would continue to fight terrorism on several fronts and would do whatever is necessary to prevent Hezbollah from re-establishing its military threat to Israel. The strike is the first on Beirut since June, when the IAF targeted alleged Hezbollah drone production sites in the southern suburbs. Israel has since strengthened air defenses in the north of the country in preparation for potential Hezbollah rocket attacks in retaliation. Now, our assessment: Ali Tabtabai was assessed to be Hezbollah's current chief of staff after most of its senior leadership had been killed by Israel. He was reportedly responsible for restoring Hezbollah's forces to war readiness and overseeing most of its units, likely making him the second most important figure in the organization after Secretary General Naim Qassem. Tabtabai had been a member of Hezbollah since its formation and had commanded the group's elite Radwan force in Syria and Yemen, where he was partly responsible for external operations against Israel. This would have almost certainly made him a high-value target for Israel, and he was likely under extensive intelligence collection. His targeting inside Beirut suggests that Israel is willing to strike senior Hezbollah leadership in politically sensitive areas, including the capital, in clear violation of the ceasefire. The killing of Tabtabai follows several days of expanded Israeli military activity in southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, involving strikes on Hezbollah weapons caches, logistics nodes, and other military targets. Israel is likely taking advantage of the current lull in Gaza to pivot military resources towards Hezbollah, aiming to halt its reconstitution as a military threat and to pressure the Lebanese government to accelerate the disarmament process. Hezbollah, however, is publicly refusing to relinquish its military capabilities and remains committed to positioning itself as an essential component of national defense against Israel. There is a realistic possibility that the recent strikes could be followed by a broader campaign aimed at degrading the militant group. While most operations would likely remain confined to southern Lebanon or the Bekaa Valley, further strikes in Beirut against high-value targets or targets of opportunity cannot be ruled out. Israeli military operations have severely weakened Hezbollah, but the group still retains some limited options for retaliation, including localized attacks on IDF positions and short-range rocket fire into Israel. However, with its leadership decimated, its logistics under strain, and Israeli military pressure increasing, Hezbollah is likely to show strategic restraint rather than give the Netanyahu administration a justification to escalate its operations. And in West Africa, Guinea-Bissau has experienced a military coup, with the president and opposition leaders detained after rival election victory claims. On November 26th, President Umaro Sissoko Embalo announced that he had been placed under arrest at around noon while in his office at the presidential palace in Bissau. According to local media, the chief and deputy chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, General Biage Na Entan and General Mamadou Touré, as well as the Minister of the Interior, Boche Condé, were also detained. The announcement came shortly after gunfire was reported in Bissau, with early accounts indicating that the shots originated near the presidential palace. The exchange lasted for roughly an hour and had stopped by 2 p.m. local time. It is not yet clear who was involved, though a spokesperson for President Embalo claimed the men were affiliated with opposition leader Fernando Dias da Costa. According to Embalo, no violence was committed against him, and the army chief of staff had orchestrated the coup. Reports later indicated that opposition leaders Dias and Domingos Simoes Pereira had also been arrested and taken to an Air Force base in Bissau. The situation in the country was described as calm following the reports of gunfire. Several elements of the Presidential Guard reportedly occupied key routes leading to the palace. Shortly afterwards, a group of military officers identifying themselves as the High Military Command for the Restoration of National Security and Public Order issued a statement on state television, announcing that they had taken total control of the country and that Guinea-Bissau's borders and airspace were now closed. The military also declared that it was assuming control of all public institutions, banning media programs, and imposing an overnight curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. local time. The arrest came only a day before results from the November 23 presidential election were due to be released. Tensions were already high, with both Embalo and leading challenger Diaz prematurely declaring victory on November 24. Each claimed to have surpassed the 50% threshold required to win outright, which would remove the need for a runoff. Speaking in Bissau, Diaz said, "We have won the presidential race. We will not have a second round." Only hours later, Embalo's campaign spokesperson, Oscar Barbosa, announced that Embalo had also won outright and urged challengers to avoid making claims that could undermine the democratic process. Now, our team's assessment. Guinea-Bissau has grappled with chronic instability since gaining independence from Portugal in 1973, marked by repeated coups and persistent political power struggles. The country has seen at least 10 successful or attempted coups, making it one of the most coup-prone states in Africa. Political instability has intensified since President Embalo postponed the elections in November 2024. The opposition regards him as an illegitimate leader, arguing that his mandate expired on February 27, 2025. The two main opposition parties were largely excluded from the electoral process, including the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, which led Guinea-Bissau's struggle for independence. The arrest of Embalo is highly likely to indicate a rupture between the presidency and the military, likely driven by his efforts to centralize authority, reshape the country's security services, and marginalize his political opponents. This coup attempt is the second in recent months, following an alleged attempt on October 31st that resulted in the arrests of several senior army officers. It is highly likely that the military, which wields considerable political influence in Guinea-Bissau, used Diaz's claim to victory as a pretext to carry out the arrest. Former Prime Minister Domingos Simoes Pereira has accused Embalo of staging a coup to justify a wider crackdown on the opposition. Diaz's claim of victory in the presidential election has highly likely given Embalo a pretext to portray him as attempting to seize power by force. Continued political instability is highly likely in the coming weeks. In the immediate term, the military will almost certainly occupy key sites, including government buildings, media outlets, airports, border crossings, and critical infrastructure. Increased military checkpoints are highly likely on major routes and around government buildings and airports. The border and airspace closures will likely remain in place for several days. In the coup of April 12, 2012, the military took 6 days to reopen the borders. Given that the military has already arrested Embalo and opposition figures to prevent the formation of a government in exile and appears to have established control over state institutions, the current border and airspace closures are unlikely to remain in force for longer than a week. There will almost certainly be a heavy security presence in Bissau and other major cities in the coming days. The arrest of the Chief and Deputy Chief of the General Staff indicates that military factionalism is highly likely. Security forces will likely carry out further arrests of senior government figures and members of opposing factions within the military. There is a realistic possibility that factions opposed to the Army Chief of Staff will mount armed resistance. A failed coup attempt in 1998, led by a dissident general, triggered a year-long civil war. The coup will almost certainly be seen as deepening Guinea-Bissau's political instability, and there is a realistic possibility that civil unrest will break out in the coming weeks. After an alleged coup attempt in 2023 and President Embalo's subsequent dissolution of parliament, small-scale protests took place near the parliamentary building, with several people burning tires. Guinea-Bissau's security forces typically respond forcefully to demonstrations, and the anticipated heavy security presence across the capital in the coming days will likely dissuade many from taking to the streets. However, given the high tensions following the rival claims of victory, there is a realistic possibility that some will still engage in competing protests. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, Pakistan has conducted airstrikes in Afghanistan following a suicide attack in Peshawar. On November 24th, 3 militants targeted the headquarters of the Federal Constabulary in Peshawar, the largest city in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The attackers arrived on a single motorcycle, parked close to the headquarters, and then assaulted the facility with grenades and small arms fire after one of them breached the compound using a suicide-borne improvised explosive device. All 3 militants and 3 constables were killed, and at least 5 others were injured. The Khyber Pakhtunkhwa authorities stated that the attackers were likely of Afghan origin, and samples of their remains have reportedly been collected for DNA testing. Now our assessment. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. However, some media outlets have suggested that the assailants were affiliated with Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, a faction linked to Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, commonly known as the Pakistani Taliban. The TTP has carried out a series of recent attacks inside Pakistan, and the Peshawar incident may have been intended to demonstrate its operational reach by striking the well-defended headquarters of the Federal Constabulary in a densely populated urban area, despite Pakistan's intensified counter-terrorism operations. Pakistan has likely concluded that the attack was orchestrated by the TTP. On November 25th, the Pakistan Air Force carried out airstrikes in the Afghan city of Khost, close to the international border in an area widely regarded as a major staging post and support hub for cross-border TTP militancy. Retaliatory airstrikes inside Afghanistan have now become an established pattern following suspected TTP attacks in Pakistan, underscoring Islamabad's willingness to target militant sanctuaries despite the risk of border clashes, reprisal attacks, and a further deterioration in relations with the Afghan Taliban. However, the Afghan Taliban has claimed that the airstrikes in Khost killed 9 children and 1 woman, and has vowed to respond appropriately. Its options for retaliation are largely limited to attacks along the Pakistan border or to sponsoring TTP operations inside Pakistan, making further militant attacks in the coming weeks highly likely. Most TTP attacks are confined to provinces near the border, such as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the former federally administered tribal areas, and Balochistan. However, the group has previously shown that it can strike far beyond its traditional areas of operation, including the 11th of November attack in central Islamabad, which was claimed by the TTP's Jamaat-ul-Ahrar faction. And finally in the region, widespread flooding continues across southern Thailand and northern Malaysia, with major disruptions to transport and ongoing evacuation efforts. Since mid-November, large parts of southern Thailand and northern Malaysia have been affected by heavy rains and flooding driven by persistent low-pressure systems along the Thai-Malaysian border, as well as the broader regional effects of Tropical Storm Senya. The storm is currently in the Strait of Malacca and moving towards the Andaman Sea. Songkhla province has been declared a disaster zone. Its main city, Hat Yai, has seen floodwaters reach 2 meters, causing significant power outages and forcing the closure of several medical facilities. At least 33 fatalities have been reported across southern Thailand. In Malaysia, flooding has been recorded in at least 8 states, including Kelantan, Perak, Kedah, Terengganu, Perlis, and Pahang. Kelantan remains the worst affected, with around 11,000 people evacuated, 2 rivers above danger level, and at least 2 fatalities reported. The Malaysia Meteorological Department has issued heavy rainfall warnings for several states until at least November 28th, with alerts remaining in place for Perak and northern Malaysia as Tropical Storm Senya moves from the Strait of Malacca into the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Now our assessment. Severe flooding across southern Thailand and northern Malaysia is highly likely to persist in the coming days. Further heavy rainfall is expected due to ongoing low-pressure systems and the onset of the northeast monsoon season, which typically runs from mid-November to March. With relief efforts hampered by the scale of the flooding, the death toll on both sides of the border is likely to rise. The Thai military, which is leading large-scale relief and evacuation operations, has deployed an aircraft carrier and a flotilla of 14 vessels carrying relief supplies and field kitchens to support the worst-affected communities. While more than 2 million people in Thailand have been impacted by the flooding, only around 13,000 have so far been moved to shelters. In Malaysia, the National Disaster Management Agency, supported by the Armed Forces and the Civil Defence Force, has deployed rescue teams, high water vehicles and boats to assist evacuees in the worst affected areas. However, access constraints, damaged infrastructure, and continued heavy rainfall, followed by further flooding, are likely to disrupt relief operations in both countries. Border crossings remain open. However, primary transport corridors in the region are likely to be affected for several days. At least 14 major rural routes have been closed across southern Thailand, while in Malaysia, at least 30 road sections across multiple states, particularly Kelantan, Perlis, Kedah, and Penang, have been fully or partially closed due to flooding, landslides, or damaged bridges. Rail operations have also been disrupted. The State Railway of Thailand has suspended 10 Southern Line services, including the cross-border route between Padang Besar in Malaysia and Hat Yai in Thailand. Hat Yai International Airport remains open, but several airlines have suspended flights to Bangkok, leaving thousands of tourists stranded. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.